Hi everyone, welcome to our next and exciting unit in IC210 all about arrays. And so in this unit, what we're going to be learning is about how to put multiple values with a single variable in C. And one way to think about that is if you remember back to a few units ago, probably last month, seems like forever ago, think about what loops did in our program. Before we had loops, if you had a program that needed to take 100 steps, then that program needed to be at least 100 lines long. But what loops allowed us to do is we could have a small program that would do a big computation, right? And I should say, just to make a distinction, I should say a long computation. So for example, what you just wrote for homework a few nights ago was computing whether or not a number is a prime. And for very large numbers, that takes a long time to do, but it only takes a few lines of code in order to do it. And that's what loops and later what we learned more recently with recursion, that's what we can do. And that's an important concept, is that we can have a simple or small program that we write, but where the computer is working very hard to execute it. And that's great for us because that's kind of the whole point of using computers in the first place, is to get the computer to work harder than we are. And so arrays are kind of that same concept, but now we can have a small program that uses a lot of memory. And again, this is going to allow us to take advantage of the strength of our computers. The computer that you have sitting on your lap right now has billions of bytes of storage available inside it for your programs to use. And so we want to take advantage of that, not just in terms of creating files, but in terms of actually storing variables in our code and in the kind of computation that we're doing. So arrays are going to allow us to do that. And what an array is at a high level is multiple values with the same type. Multiple values in a list with all with the same type. And so what we're going to look at in this video is mostly the syntax of arrays and how we can declare and use arrays that are declared on the stack. So that's what we're going to take a look at right now. And we're going to start by looking at a small example program. Okay, so here's the program that we're going to look at as a first example of where arrays are going to be useful. And what this program is doing is opening up a file and then adding up everything in each column of that file. So, for example, I'm imagining that you run a small chain of pizza stores, and so you track every day in this file how many pizzas each store has sold each day. And then you want to add up at the end of the month or something how much each store has stored in total. So we want to add up everything in this column, everything in this column, and everything in this column, and show those values at the end. And so far, this program isn't using arrays. So far, this program is doing everything we already know about. It's opening the file and then creates three variables for the three sums of each column, and then does some scanfs and adds to column 1, then adds to column 2, then adds to column 3, and goes back and does that repeatedly until we get to the end, and then we print out the totals down here. So if we compile this and run it, if you're very fast with mental math, you can check those numbers, but they are correct, and that shows us the total in each column. Okay, so that's great. That definitely works. But hopefully you can think of some ways in which this is not ideal and where we could potentially think about improving it. And the main thing is that it's a very inflexible program right now. So there's kind of two things. Is that one is that there's a little bit of repetition, and the other one is that it's inflexible. So if our empire of pizza stores expands and we have more stores, so I made another file, pizza2.txt, that has a lot more days in it, but also it has 8 stores. Well, so far our program has the number of stores kind of like really intricately hard-coded into the program as equaling 3. Now, if we wanted to allow 8 stores, we could rewrite this program to have a bunch more call 4, call 5, call 6, call 7, call 8, and then have a bunch more lines here. But hopefully you can see that should start to feel bad for you at this point. You should feel icky when you're just copying the same thing multiple times over and again. And you should know that there's usually a better way to do that in terms of code. And this is where arrays are going to come in handy and be useful for us. So let's see how we can use arrays to make this solution be a little bit more elegant. What we're going to do is, instead of having multiple different variables for each column, we're going to have a single variable name that holds multiple values. So first, I'm just going to replace the program as it is, but using an array so we can see the syntax. So we'll say int columns, and the syntax is we say the type first, then the name, and then in square brackets we say how big it is. So this means declare an array of length 3 with ints, of 3 ints. And we can also initialize this to all zeros with this syntax like this. So 0, 0, 0 works, but you can actually just put 1, 0 and it'll set them all equal to 0. And so that's great. We make an array of 3 ints, and we're going to initialize them all to 0 initially. And now I can just treat those, instead of these 3 variable names, I can treat the parts of this array as variables. So instead of call 1, I'm going to have call index 0. And here's the syntax to use for that. So again, the square brackets come into play when we're dealing with arrays. So this refers to just the first entry. So add to the first array entry. And then what I'm going to do here is, what I used to have a variable called call2, I'm going to call index 1. This is adds to the second array entry, and then we'll do the next one down here. And you should notice that what was call 1, call 2, and call 3 when I had them as variable names, well, those could have been any names. But when I'm using arrays, I have to use the index starting at 0. Indices from 0 up to 2 when we have an array of size 3. So when I just have different variable names, of course, I could say what I want. But in an array, you have to use index 0, index 1, and index 2 up to whatever the size of the array is. Okay, and then I'll change each of these as well to just use those array indices the same. All right, let's see if this works. Nope. What did I do wrong? Okay, I said call instead of calls. And a little trick, if you're quick with your Vim foo knowledge, I'm going to change all instances of the complete word call. So that's what the backslash angle bracket thing does there. And I'm going to change all of those to be calls across all lines. And that's a wonderful little trick. There we go. And so now this works for pizza1.txt. But of course, it's still not going to work for pizza2.txt, which had 8 stores. And in fact, I haven't really gained that much here. I guess I avoided declaring each of the variables separately, but I didn't really simplify my program much. I just have a different weird-looking variable name like calls square bracket 0, calls square bracket 1, calls square bracket 2. But this is showing already the idea of what arrays are. It's just giving us a bunch of kind of variables all at once, all with the same type and all with the same name, where we make the distinction between them with the square brackets. But the key and awesome thing about arrays is that we can actually put a variable inside this square brackets. So this doesn't just have to be something hard-coded into our program. We can have this be any value. And in this case, what we want this to be here is n calls. So that's the number that we read from the file, but we weren't doing anything with it before. And so now the indices are going to go up from 0 up to n calls minus 1. So ncalls could equal 3, like for pizza1.txt, or it could equal 8, and I'm going to get an array of that size, whatever the user selected. And okay, so now here, how do I know what to do here? This is 0, 1, and 2 at the moment, but of course now I could have an array that's bigger or smaller. How can I account for that? Well, I could keep copying these out more and more and have like an if statement to select when to stop. But hopefully you recognize that, I'm doing the same kind of thing again and again a certain number of times. Sounds like a good situation for a loop. And in this case, because the first entry is kind of special from this scanf, I'm going to start the loop here. And I'm going to make this be a for loop. Int I should start at 1. And it should go up to ncalls minus 1. So I'm going to say I less than ncalls. And then this is going to go into the loop. And instead of adding to the second array entry here, this is going to add to the ith array entry. So the real power of arrays is that I can use them in loops and now do multiple things like this. So this is going to be my loop now, which adds to each part of this array by reading in. And the other thing I need to change that's unfortunately going to go to more than one line now is this printf. So I can no longer just print everything at once because I can't have kind of a loop in the array arguments. And so, I'm sorry, in the function arguments here. So this is going to have to say totals. And then if you think about it, there's a space before each number. So I'm going to have a loop that says like for I equals 0. This time I'm starting at 0 because I'm not treating the first one separately. And each time I'll just print out a space and then that number. And then I need my new line at the end. Okay, so what did I just do is I used the power of arrays, which is that I can access each element of the array in a loop. So I'm still treating this kind of the same as you would have treated any other variable name in terms of the argument in my printf or in terms of the thing that I'm adding to here. But now the difference is that I have a variable for the index itself. Which is I in both cases, but it could be some other int. As long as it's an int and you know that it's within the range of 0 up to the size minus 1 of your array, then this is always going to work just like it would accessing any other variable in your file. Let's check it out. Let's cross our fingers and see if we did it right. So make sums. We didn't do it right. What did I do wrong? Aha. Okay, so it's telling me that I can't actually initialize this to all zeros because I used a variable for the size there. So that's my forgetting how C works. Yeah, and that actually makes sense. So I have to just declare this, and it's telling me that I can't set all of those to 0 just in one line like that. I could have if this was a fixed number like 3 or something, but now I have to make another loop to set them all to 0. That's okay. This kind of loop that I'm writing right now, you'll see that it just rolls off my fingers very naturally to do something once for each element of an array. And that's because we do this all the time. You can see in this program, there's 2 places where this exact loop is used, and another place where it's almost exactly the same. It just starts at 1. So this kind of a loop that goes from 0 up to size minus 1 and does something for each thing in an array is a very, very common situation because it's common that we want to repeat some action for each element of an array in a loop. Okay, so that's going to actually set them all to 0, and hopefully this will work now. Great. And let's run it, and we'll try pizza1.txt. That works, so those are the same numbers as before. And now the big question is, does pizza2.txt work? And, well, you don't have any way of checking whether my math is right, but they all look to be about right, and also there's 8 of them, which is the real key. Because remember, at the beginning of pizza2.txt, we have 8 stores. And we could check this actually by saying like head 3 lines of pizza2.txt pizza3.txt. It's a little bit of bash foo for you that took the first 3 lines out of pizza2.txt and put them in pizza3.txt. So now I can check in a smaller file where I can actually make sure the math is right. Pizza3.txt, and now, yes, that looks awesome. And so what we did is we took a program which was inflexible because it was only limited to a certain number of variables because we had to declare each variable separately. And we made it into a flexible program that can handle any number of columns. And it also, so some parts of it got more complicated because we have to have more loops, but there's also less repetition here. And now with the same exact program, I could also handle a file that has, 100 stores or 1,000 stores. And I wouldn't have to change anything about my program at all because now it's quite a powerful program. So some of the concepts here is the array declaration syntax. So this is declaring an array. And then using the elements of an array is like this. So that's our first little step into arrays. We will learn a lot more and get a lot more practice with how to use them. But for now, just remember that an array is multiple values, all with the same type. And the indices, we use ints to index into an array, and it's all with the square brackets for all these syntax elements.